Have you ever had someone look you dead in the eye and try to convince you that what's yours isn't yours? I didn't think I'd ever cross paths with that level of delusion, but then Margaret Phillips happened. She walked straight into my life like she owned it, waving around a stack of papers and insisting she had rights to my backyard. My backyard. And what came after that? Well, it taught me how far some people will go when they think they're in charge. It had only been 3 months since I moved into Cedar Grove Estates. The place had a certain charm: wide, clean streets, neatly trimmed lawns, oak trees older than most of the residents, and neighbors who actually smiled when you passed them on the road. After the mess my life had become, ending a marriage I should have left years before, I was ready for a fresh start, the kind where you build something new, something yours. That's why I bought the house. A two-story colonial with a backyard big enough to finally start the workshop I'd been dreaming of. Furniture making had been my thing since before life got messy, and I was ready to make it more than a hobby. The best part? The previous owner had already laid a concrete pad out back. It was perfect. I got my plans drawn up, jumped through the necessary hoops, got the HOA's sign-off, and I was ready to break ground. That's when Margaret entered the picture. And when I say entered, I mean like an invading army. It was one of those crisp Saturday mornings where everything seems to be going right. I had music playing low on my phone while I measured out the workshop footprint, the kind of peaceful moment I hadn't had in a long time. Then I heard it, the sharp clack of heels on pavement, and then her shadow falling over my markings. "Excuse me," she said, cold and sharp, "but what exactly do you think you're doing?" I stood up, brushed the dust off my hands, and offered the kind of polite smile you give someone who's clearly confused. "Good morning. I'm Alex Chun, just marking out where my workshop will go. HOA approved the plans last week." Her eyebrows lifted like she'd caught me red-handed stealing office supplies. "I'm Margaret Phillips," she said, "president of the HOA, and I don't recall approving any such thing." She tapped her leather portfolio like it was a badge of authority. "That area," she continued, "is a community access point." At first, I thought I misheard her. "I'm sorry," I said, glancing back at my survey lines. "This is my yard. There's no access point. I have the deed and paperwork inside if you want to take a look." Her mouth thinned into a hard line. "Perhaps you're not familiar with how things are done here," she said. "This pathway has been used by the community for decades. Maintenance crews need access, inspections. You understand?" I didn't. There's no easement, no right-of-way. The property line's clear. I motioned to my paperwork sitting on the patio table a few steps away. That's when things got weird. Margaret stepped right onto the chalk lines I'd marked, grinding her heel into them like she was stamping out a cigarette. "We don't appreciate newcomers disrupting established procedures," she said, cold as ice. "This pathway stays open, or there will be consequences." I stared at her, disbelief giving way to anger. "Are you threatening me?" Her smile was thin, calculated. "I'm informing you of the community standards. The board takes violations very seriously." Then she turned, leaving me standing there, with my survey in hand and a pit growing in my stomach. It wasn't about a path. It wasn't about community access. Margaret Phillips was letting me know exactly who ran Cedar Grove Estates, and she wasn't subtle about it. That was just the beginning. The next morning, there was a neon orange notice stuck to my front door. Violation, unauthorized construction, obstructing community access, a fine of $500 if I didn't comply in 48 hours. I took photos of everything, fired off a detailed email to the board with all the paperwork attached, and waited. Margaret replied within the hour. 2 sentences. "Historical access overrides recent documentation." No explanation. No legal backing. Just bureaucracy in its most arrogant form. Things escalated fast. My survey stakes vanished overnight. My trash cans, usually tucked neatly by the side of the house, started showing up right in the middle of the so-called pathway. Every morning like clockwork. After the third time, I installed cameras. And sure enough, there she was. Margaret and her husband, out on their early morning jog, both of them dressed in matching windbreakers, casually dragging my bins exactly where they'd block any construction. I thought that was the worst of it. Then my doorbell rang. Sarah Martinez, my neighbor from next door, stood there nervously glancing over her shoulder. I let her in, and we talked. "You're not the first," she told me, voice low like we were plotting a prison break. "Margaret ran the Peters out 6 months after they tried to build a greenhouse. Before them, the Thompsons wanted a pool. Margaret claimed it violated some ancient water rights. Next thing they knew, their cars were keyed and their kids' bikes disappeared." I asked the obvious question. "Why doesn't anyone fight back?" Sarah didn't hesitate. Her husband was a judge. She has people at City Hall. The last family that pushed back? Margaret made their lives hell until they sold. That explained the fear I saw in people's eyes when I waved hello. The next day, I got an email from the city's building department. Anonymous complaint about my workshop plans. Potential violations. They'd have to review everything again. It didn't take a genius to figure out where that came from. But Margaret wasn't ready to stop there. I came home from work one evening to find her and 2 other board members in my backyard, measuring tape in hand, acting like they were doing me a favor. "Monthly inspection," she said when I confronted her. "Section 7.3 of the bylaws." I checked that night. There was no Section 7.3. That was it for me. Margaret had spent years turning the HOA into her own personal weapon, and maybe everyone else had backed down, but not me. I'd already lost too much in my life. I wasn't about to lose this. The next morning, I went online and ordered a top-of-the-line security system. Motion sensors, HD cameras, cloud backups. Every square inch of my property was going to be monitored. Every email, every violation, every word she said, I was going to document it all. Margaret must have sensed something was changing because her tactics got even bolder. She doubled down on the violation notices. I started finding them in my mailbox on my windshield taped to my front door. She was documenting me as aggressively as I was documenting her. But each time she crossed a line, she was handing me exactly what I needed. Evidence. One night reviewing the camera feeds, I saw her. Margaret out front at 3 in the morning, dressed in dark clothes, pouring something on my lawn. Lines, precise. Like she was marking off a field for a game only she knew the rules to. But she didn't realize my cameras had night vision, or that the audio picked up everything, including her muttering to herself about dealing with difficult people. That was just the beginning of my war room. One wall of my garage turned into a timeline. Dates, times, photos. Every petty act. Every rule she made up on the spot. 27 violation notices, including one for excessive surveillance equipment. Apparently, protecting your own property wasn't allowed in Margaret's fantasy world. And then came the real break. Tom Richards, ex-HOA board member. We met 2 towns over because he didn't want to be seen talking to me. He handed me a USB drive, financial records, meeting minutes, proof Margaret had been rewriting bylaws to suit herself, siphoning HOA funds to pay for landscaping contracts run by her brother. But the knockout punch came from Sarah Martinez. She'd kept a diary. 5 years' worth of Margaret's tactics, dates, photos, testimony about how Margaret isolated her daughter because they wanted to put up a treehouse. A 10-year-old girl cut off from her friends because her mother stood up to Margaret. Others came forward. The Hendersons, who had been denied solar panels. The Williams family, who were blocked from building an accessibility ramp. The Patels, who got violation notices for holiday decorations. One story after another. Victims, each thinking they were alone, now realizing they weren't. And Margaret. She must have sensed something was closing in, because that's when she made her worst mistake yet. I came home from work to find the concrete pad, my workshop's foundation, reduced to rubble. Someone had jackhammered it overnight. The footage showed Margaret in her SUV, watching as hired workers tore it up. She even had the nerve to supervise. Luckily for me, the contractor she hired didn't like being lied to. He'd been told the work was authorized. He gave me a sworn statement, showed me the text messages from Margaret herself, instructing him to remove the illegal structure by any means necessary. Then the email came in. Emergency HOA meeting. The subject? Persistent rule violations and community safety concerns. In other words, Margaret was planning to make me the example, but she was walking into a trap she didn't even know I'd set. The night of the meeting, I arrived early. Too early. The community hall was nearly empty, just a few folding chairs lined up in neat rows. the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. I set up my laptop and the projector I'd borrowed from work. The screen flickered to life and I queued up everything. Videos, audio clips, emails, the timeline. It was all there, meticulously organized, waiting for the perfect moment. By the time the meeting officially started, the place was packed. I'd never seen so many people show up for an HOA meeting in my life. Usually you're lucky to get 5 people who aren't already on the board. But tonight it was standing room only. Every neighbor who had ever been wronged by Margaret was there, and a few curious newcomers who'd heard the stories and wanted to see for themselves. Margaret strutted in like she was walking onto a movie set where she was both director and star. She took her seat at the head of the table, surrounded by the last loyal members of her board. 2 people who looked like they were questioning their life choices. Margaret had even arranged the lighting behind her chair so that it cast her in this glow, like she was some kind of savior. But if you squinted, she looked more like a Bond villain about to give a monologue. She cleared her throat, tapped her gavel, and smiled that tight, condescending smile. Let's come to order. First item on the agenda, community standards violations, specifically the ongoing actions of Mr. Chun. She said my name like it tasted bad. I let her go on for a minute or two, spouting off about how my surveillance cameras were invasive, how my workshop violated aesthetic guidelines, how my refusal to comply with HOA notices had disrupted community harmony. And then I stood up. Actually, I said, I have something I think the board and the community should see. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You're out of order, I smiled. According to the bylaws, not the ones you rewrote, the actual ones, any resident can present evidence of misconduct at a community meeting. The room was quiet. I clicked to the first video. Margaret, in all her glory, caught on high-definition camera at 3 in the morning, pouring lines of grass killer across my front lawn. Silent gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's hands clenched into fists on the table, her knuckles white. I kept going. The next clip. Margaret standing by as workers jackhammered my workshop foundation. Her voice was clear as day, telling them to make sure it looks like an accident. The contractor's statement scrolled onto the screen right after, along with screenshots of her text messages. And then I dropped the real hammer. 17 residents have given me statements detailing harassment, intimidation, and the misuse of HOA authority, I said. Some of you are here tonight. I turned toward Sarah Martinez, who stood, holding up her diary like it was a legal exhibit. We've all lived under this for too long, Sarah said, voice steady. Margaret isolated my daughter because we wouldn't play by her rules. She spread lies about us. She's done it to all of us. Murmurs of agreement, heads nodding. Margaret's face was pure disbelief, like the script she'd written had suddenly been rewritten by someone else. This is a smear campaign, she spat. Baseless accusations. I clicked again. This time Tom Richards stood. I was on the board, he said. I saw what she did. I kept copies of the records, the fake bylaws, the missing funds. His voice was shaky but firm. She's been stealing from us for years. And then, as if on cue, the 2 detectives I'd invited stepped into the room. They moved quietly but deliberately, flashing their badges as they made their way forward. Margaret Phillips, one of them said, we need you to come with us. We have warrants for criminal harassment, vandalism, and embezzlement. Margaret's jaw dropped. This is ridiculous. I made this community what it is. No, I said quietly. You made people afraid to live here. That ends tonight. Margaret tried to bolt. For a woman in her 60s, she was surprisingly quick, but not quick enough. The detectives caught her before she got halfway to the door. The room was dead silent as they cuffed her and read her rights. The meeting ended early after that. The days that followed felt surreal. The rest of the board resigned almost immediately. A full audit revealed more than any of us expected. Margaret had been siphoning money into a personal account under the guise of emergency maintenance funds. She funneled landscaping contracts to her brother's company and approved bogus fines against anyone who challenged her authority. It had all been right there in the records. No one had thought to question it until now. The community rallied after that. We held new elections, transparent ones. We rewrote the bylaws publicly, with oversight, and with input from every homeowner who wanted a say. Term limits, checks and balances, and clear dispute processes were all put in place. The HOA became what it was supposed to be, a tool to help, not to control. As for me, my workshop was rebuilt. Margaret had ordered its destruction, and the HOA covered every penny to fix it. They even helped pour the new foundation, neighbors bringing over drinks and snacks, people lending a hand, laughing like we were at a block party instead of fixing something that had been broken. That so-called community access pathway through my backyard never existed. There was no record of it. Margaret made it up to justify her power grab. 6 months later, Cedar Grove Estates was a different place. Kids played in yards without fear that chalk drawings would be deemed graffiti. Families put up whatever holiday decorations they wanted. Sarah's daughter got her treehouse. The Patels hosted an incredible Diwali celebration that the whole neighborhood attended. The Williams family finally installed that accessibility ramp, and we all pitched in to help rebuild their garden. I kept the cameras up, not because I was worried about another Margaret, but because they reminded me how far we'd come. They weren't about fear anymore. They were about peace of mind. Margaret? Last I heard, she took a plea deal. House arrest, restitution payments. She moved away, of course. Rumor has it she's in a condo now, one without an HOA. Sometimes I wonder if she looks out over her new place, seeing how little power she has and realizes what she lost. Then again, maybe not. People like Margaret rarely believe they're the villain, but the rest of us, we know better. Now, when I walk the streets of Cedar Grove Estates, people wave. They smile. They stop to chat about their kids, their dogs, their gardens. There's no more whispered warnings or side glances. No more fear that a rogue HOA president might decide you're next. That's what community really is. Not power trips and made-up rules. It's people looking out for each other, helping each other, standing up together when someone tries to tear that down. And me? I've got a workshop full of projects, neighbors who stop by just to see what I'm working on, and a neighborhood that finally feels like home. Sometimes it takes standing up to a bully to make things right, and sometimes it just takes one person who refuses to back down. Looking back, I don't regret a single moment of it, because we didn't just take back a neighborhood, we built a community.